Hi, so my intent of this spark plug changing video is different from other videos in that I will be giving you different angles and also different close-ups when I am changing the spark plugs. But also because I'm a beginner, I want to give you some pain points and frustrations that I went through that were unexpected from a person who was doing this for the first time. So I'm going to start off here with the tools that you'll be needing. So the first tools you'll need is the 3/8 inch ratchet. So this is a Sears ratchet that I have, and you'll also need an extension. This is a 6-inch extension, 3/8 inch, and this is a 10mm extended socket along with the shorter 10mm socket, and you only need one socket here. So the other thing I have here is the gear wrench spark plug socket. And also what you'll need is these spark plug dielectric grease and also anti-seize lubricant, and these were $1.50 each at your local auto parts store. And also for Honda here, I'll be using the Iridium spark plugs. So there are 4 10mm bolts at the top that retain the protective cover, and I'll be removing each of these. So one of the things you want to do the first time you remove these bolts is to remember the force it took to remove them. So these 4 particular bolts are very light, and so when you're tightening them, there's really no tension in them. They're barely a quarter turn after they have been tightened snug. And the reason why that's important is because when you put it back on, you don't want to over tighten these, and to know the right amount of tension or right amount of torque, not tension but torque, to actually put in these is very important. So I just want to show you the close-up view of how the bolts look like. So after you remove this protective plastic plate, just put it in a safe place so you don't step on it, and you might want to clean it because there is some oil spots on it. Now I do want to give you a close-up view here of the dirt around the spark plugs. So this is the electrical conductor that goes down in the spark plugs, and it is, for the most part, it is plastic. And you'll see there's 4 bolts there that are for each one of these terminals. And you can see all the dirt and grime that's on them. And that blue thing, or the blue plug there, is the electrical plug, and I'll be removing each one of those. So just a close-up look, and you might want to clean off the dirt here so that it doesn't get into the bottom of the spark plugs when you're cleaning and when you're removing them. But personally, I actually didn't bother, but you might want to clean it just in case. So I'm going to clean these terminals out a little bit and remove the bolts on each one. So there are 4 bolts that hold down 4 of the electrical terminals, and what you want to remember here is, again, to remember the amount of tightness or torque that is required to turn these bolts. And for these particular ones, they're actually only 8 pounds, but when we're doing it by hand, it's very tough to remember what 8 pounds is. But for the most part, once again, this is once you have the bolt snug, to just give it that 1/4 turn of the bolt, which is the amount of tightness that's needed to be tight enough, but to not over tighten. So I'm going to remove the far bolt here and using the 10mm, and all of these bolts are lefty loosey, righty tighty, meaning to loosen them you go counterclockwise and to tighten them you go clockwise. So the bolts for the 2nd electrical terminal and the 4th electrical terminals are the taller bolts, and I'll be using the taller 10mm to remove those. Once again, making a mental note of just how tight or how much torque was used to remove these bolts, so when I replace them I know the amount of force to use to tighten them. And so this is the taller bolt, as you can see, and I'll be removing the other 2 bolts the same exact way. So after I remove the 4 bolts from the 4 terminals, you have to lift the electrical terminals, and I found them not as easy to lift as I saw in the other videos. And what ended up happening was I couldn't lift them all and remove them together, what I had to do was remove the electrical plug first. So think about this, the terminals themselves are about 7 inches deep, and there's the wiring that is a little bit short. So to remove a 7-inch terminal basically from that is 7 inches deep from a small hole like that, it's not easy to do all in one unit. So what I did was I detached each one of these blue electrical terminals just by squeezing those thumb plugs on the side there and remove them separately. So as I mentioned before, lifting each one of these separately and unclipping them was the easiest way for me to get them out, given how long they extend into the hole. So you'll see I removed the electrical clip and I'm lifting the electrical terminal out, and you'll notice the electrical terminals are a little bit more fragile than I thought. They are basically plastic with a little bit of rubber. So at the end there is that rubber, and there's the top view there. But I just want to show you just a little bit of how fragile it is, and in that hole there's actually a little spring that connects to the spark plug itself. So what I'm going to do is just basically place these down on the engine here, and I'm just going to lift each one of these one by one. So I'm going to do the second one, and basically you see using that clip there and unclipping it. So after I unplug these, I'm going to give you an up-close view of each one of these individually. So you'll see I have these laid aside on the engine itself, and I'm going to put these away in a place where I don't step on them, which I actually put it in the car. So you can see each one of these electrical plugs, and inside down there is the hole for each one of the spark plugs. And I just want to give you a view so you could see just how these things are and what to expect when you're doing it, as I didn't see any of the videos on YouTube that actually had this close-up view here. So you might want to clean off a little bit of that dirt. I actually left it there, cleaned out a little bit, but not much of it. So finally I'm ready to remove the spark plugs, and I'm going to use my 3/8" socket wrench here. And what I'm going to need is an extension. So that's a 6-inch extension, even though I have the spark plug wrench there. And that's because the spark plugs are actually pretty deep. They're about 8 inches deep. So the spark plug wrench itself extends about 6 inches, and I have the 6-inch extension. So this is going to be one of my most important tips here. So I'm reaching down, I'm putting my magnetic spark plug wrench into the spark plug, and I'm trying to notice the amount of strength that it takes for me to actually loosen the spark plug. And the truth of the matter is, when I was removing each one of these 4 spark plugs, they all used a different amount of torque, a different amount of strength for me to remove them. So it seems like the torque level, whoever installed these spark plugs, and this is the original spark plugs, so they were factory put in, used a different amount of torque to each one of these. And the rated torque for this spark plug is actually like 13.5 pounds to 14 pounds. So what I should have done was I should have bought a torque wrench and used the torque. What I was hoping to do was actually to gauge with my hands. When I removed the original spark plug, I was going to try to make a mental note of how much strength it took for me to remove the spark plug, and use an equal amount of torque or strength to actually tighten it. But what I found was that I wasn't able to do that because without having to visually look at how tight you are tightening something, you tend to not be able to feel exactly how tight you've actually tightened something. I originally thought I was going to tighten it snug and then do a quarter turn or third turn or half a turn and leave it at that. But unfortunately, it was very hard to gauge exactly how much it actually took to remove the spark plug. Now here I am comparing the two old and new spark plugs. And as it turns out, that the old spark plugs weren't all that bad. It was pretty decent. So I'm going to zoom in here and give you a closer look. That the tip itself was still very much intact. And actually, these Iridium NGK spark plugs seem to have lasted pretty decently and pretty long for 100,000 miles. So these were the original spark plugs in it, and they went 100,000 miles, 101,000 miles basically. And you could see they are still pretty decent, and this was the case with all four of them. So now I'm simply going to put in the new spark plug. So I am going to put this into the spark plug wrench, and because it's magnetic, it hangs on pretty tightly. And after this, I will be putting the anti-seize. So I'm going to open my little packet of anti-seize here. So you notice this is the anti-seize lubricant, and it's a little bit of a metallic type of paste. So what I'm going to do is put some of this on my finger, and I find that using my finger to put it on the threads. So what I'm doing is I'm putting it on most of the threads up until the second or third thread that's closest to the spark plug tip. So as you can see, it's a little bit of the metallic paste, so I'm going to rub a little bit of it onto the threads, and I'm going to try to avoid getting it on the tip. So I am going to put it on almost all of the threads, spreading it with my finger, and make sure to have plenty of paper towels handy to clean off a little bit of the mess. But I'm going to spread it with my finger and avoid the second to third thread on the tip, and just spread it in the upper threads there. And after this, I am going to lower it down and start installing the new spark plug. So I'm going to thread these by hand initially. I don't have the ratchet on the spark plug wrench. I am basically twisting it by hand because I don't want to cross thread anything. So right now I'm just going by feel and doing it gently. So I am going to hand tighten as much as I can, and once it's snug, I will be using the wrench. But that's very important to not cross thread it, so definitely go by feel at first and make sure you're just lightly turning it clockwise, righty-tighty, and basically, you know, being very paranoid not to cross thread anything initially, and gently just twisting it. And after that, I am just simply going to tighten it. And unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I am tightening these by hand, meaning that I have no true feel of the 14 pounds that this should be. And basically, right now, I am just going to repeat for the other spark plugs what I did for the first one. And as you can see, for this particular one, as I'm removing it, they are all different tensions, as I mentioned before, which surprised me a little bit. But what's important is definitely, if you're a beginner, to actually get a torque wrench and set it at 14 pounds for each one of these spark plugs, and that will give you a little bit more confidence. I mean, even if you tightened it to 20 pounds, I think that's okay. As far as for me, I just wanted to make sure, because you gotta remember, the threads at the bottom actually has a lot of dirt and grease to it. So as you're turning it, it's not as smooth as you think, and because you can't visually look at how tight it is very hard to judge just by feel as to how tight you actually did do it. I try to tighten it. I figured I would be moderately tight as I can, but unfortunately I wish I did get a torque wrench, which would have just been an extra $20 in basically a lot of the tools I got, because between the $10 spark plugs and also the paste, which was $150 each, I only spent about $65 on the parts itself. So definitely make sure you get a torque wrench. So once again, I am just simply tightening these as consistently as I can, one at a time. And I really do wish I had a torque wrench. I probably over-torqued these about 30-40 pounds. So the next thing I'm going to do here is putting the dielectric paste or grease. on the electrical terminals. So as you can see, I'm just gonna smudge some grease here, some of this dielectric grease, and it was only $1.50 at my local AutoZone. So you'll see I have it down, and I use my finger and pinky and I pushed it down a little bit and try to spread it around in that hole. And I did that for each one of these. So here I'm simply going to lower each one of the electrical terminals and clip the electrical plug back in until it clicks. So once you hear the click, it's nice and snug in there. And I'm going to do that for each 4 of these. So after I put on these electrical plugs, what I'm going to do next is put the screws back in. So the screws on the terminals, just keep in mind that the 2nd and 4th ones are the taller ones. So make sure you put those in the right spots, the 2nd and 4th ones as the taller ones. So these particular bolts on the terminals, you don't want to over tighten these. You could do a 1/4 turn after you've tightened it snug. They don't have to be overly tight here. Now comes the easy part, which is just to replace this cover here. And this cover, really the nuts on this one really goes on pretty lightly. You don't want to over tighten these and crack the cover. So keep in mind when you're removing these, just try to notice how little strength or amount of strength that it takes to replace them, and use the same amount of force. So for this one, it's really light, and but that's really it. That completes the spark plug change, and I hope this helped, and thank you for watching.